there. Ready to dive into something that could really change the game for frontline managers like you.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're going to unpack this guide, Embracing Mistakes, a frontline manager's guide to fostering growth and innovation. And get this, it's not just about letting a few slip-ups slide.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's about actually using those mistakes to your advantage.
Interesting. What's fascinating is how this guide flips the script.
Yeah.
So instead of fearing failure, what if we're actually got excited about what we could learn from it?
Right. And it jumps right in with some thought-provoking ideas. Like they talk about creating a failure resume and hosting these mistake of the month meetings. I know those might sound a little unorthodox at first.
They do seem a bit counterintuitive, yeah. But if you think about Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, it kind of clicks.
Okay, so walk us through this whole growth mindset thing a bit more. How does that work for someone on the front lines dealing with, the everyday pressures of managing a team?
Basically, it's about encouraging your team to believe they can always improve, with effort and dedication. It's about shifting that focus from being perfect to embracing the learning process, even when that means, making mistakes along the way.
So instead of freaking out when someone messes up, you encourage the team to be like, okay, so what do we learn from that? How can we do better next time?
Exactly. It creates this way more supportive and encouraging environment for taking risks and trying new things, because they know that even if they don't succeed, it's still a valuable learning experience.
And this guide doesn't just throw this theory at you. They bring up some pretty compelling real-world examples. Like, remember when Steve Jobs got fired from Apple?
Oh, yeah.
You could argue that was a pretty big mistake. Right?
Oh, absolutely. That's a perfect example. What seemed like this major setback for Jobs ended up being a pivotal moment in his journey. He took that experience, reevaluated, innovated, and he came back even stronger.
And look at companies like Google and Amazon.
Right.
They've baked this whole embracing mistakes thing into their core values.
To stay ahead of the game, you got to be willing to experiment, take risks, and, yeah, sometimes even fall flat on your face.
Yeah, it's like that saying you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. But it's more than just accepting that mistakes will happen. This guide is about actually using them as stepping stones.
Absolutely. It's about changing your perspective. It's not about punishing mistakes, but rather dissecting them, understanding why they happened, and using that knowledge to do better next time.
So it's less about pointing fingers and more about saying, okay, team, let's learn from this and come out stronger on the other side.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established that mistakes can be valuable, but how do we actually put this into practice? The guide outlines 5 strategies that we're going to dive into.
And these strategies are all about that mindset shift we were talking about, right?
Right.
Moving away from this fear of messing up and embracing those aha moments.
Right. So strategy number 1 is the failure resume. Now, I have to admit, when I first heard that, I was like, wait, what?
It's not as scary as it sounds.
Okay, good.
It's about reframing those moments that we usually try to avoid talking about. So instead of sweeping failures under the rug, encourage your team to actually document them. Analyze what went wrong, why it went wrong, and most importantly, what they learned from it.
It's like turning those oops moments into aha moments. So instead of hiding from your failures, you're actually highlighting them as learning experiences.
Precisely.
Okay, now for strategy number 2. This one really piqued my interest. The mistake of the month meeting. Tell me more.
I love this one. It's brilliant because it normalizes making mistakes. Just imagine getting your team together once a month to openly discuss a significant mistake that happened. Not to point fingers, but to really understand, the root cause and brainstorm solutions together.
So it's like a blame-free zone where everyone can learn from each other's experiences. It's like turning those post-mortem meetings into something proactive.
Yeah.
And way less intimidating. So instead of waiting for things to go wrong, you're actively trying to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third strategy, rewarding intelligent risk-taking.
Okay, so this is where we put our money where our mouths are, right? We can't just say we're cool with mistakes. We actually have to create an environment where people feel safe taking risks, calculated risks.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing and celebrating those who are willing to push the envelope. Try new things, even if it doesn't always work out perfectly. The key here is calculated risks, right? We're talking about well-thought-out ideas with the potential for big rewards.
Right, right. And even if the risk doesn't pay off, there's still a valuable learning experience baked into the process.
Exactly. It's about fostering that growth mindset we were talking about earlier. Now, the fourth strategy is all about, getting ahead of potential problems. the pre-mortem technique.
This one sounds interesting. It's like predicting the future, right?
In a way, yeah. So imagine this. You're about to kick off this new project, but instead of just jumping right in, you get your team together and you ask them to imagine the project has completely failed.
Oh, wow.
And then you work backward, figuring out all the potential pitfalls and roadblocks that could have led to that failure.
So you're basically playing out a worst-case scenario in advance.
Exactly. It's like you're giving your team a metaphorical crystal ball. Helps them spot potential problems before they even arise.
I like it. Okay, and that brings us to the fifth and final strategy, the learning loop. What's that all about?
Think of it as like weaving continuous improvement into the fabric of how your team works. After every project, big or small, take the time to have a debrief. What went well, what didn't? And most importantly, what could you do differently next time?
It's like that saying, experience is the best teacher. But it's not just about having the experience, it's about actually reflecting on it, learning from it.
Exactly. And by documenting these learnings, you create this knowledge base that the entire team can benefit from. It's all about fostering that culture of continuous learning and improvement.
This all sounds great in theory, but I'm sure some listeners are thinking, okay, this is great, but what about the challenges? It can't be all sunshine and roses. And the guide does acknowledge that, putting these ideas into practice isn't always easy.
Right. There are some real challenges too, like actually implementing these strategies, especially in a work environment where the focus is often on hitting those targets and not making any mistakes.
Right. It's that whole perfection or bust mentality that can really stifle, innovation and growth.
Exactly. And one of the biggest challenges the guide highlights is this fear of negative performance reviews.
Which makes sense, right? If you're constantly being judged on your mistakes, you're going to want to avoid them at all costs.
Right. It creates this culture of fear where people are afraid to speak up, to take risks, to really innovate.
So how do we address that? Like, how do we create an environment where people feel safe to make mistakes and learn from them?
Well, communication is key. It's about working with your team to create a shared understanding that mistakes are a part of the learning process. It's about shifting that focus from blame to understanding and growth.
So creating that psychologically safe environment where people feel comfortable, admitting to their mistakes, knowing they won't be punished for it.
Exactly.
Okay. What about the pressure for short-term results? That can often feel at odds with embracing, experimentation and potential setbacks.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance, right, between pushing for innovation and ensuring you're still delivering those short-term wins.
So how do you do that? How do you balance those two things?
It's about highlighting the long-term benefits of embracing mistakes. Data can be really powerful here. Showing your stakeholders how this approach can lead to increased productivity, a more innovative culture, and ultimately a stronger bottom line.
So it's about connecting those dots, right, between embracing mistakes and actually achieving those big picture goals.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the possibility of team members trying to hide their mistakes, especially if they feel like they'll be penalized for them.
Right. It's like sweeping those mistakes under the rug, which prevents everyone from actually learning from them.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to create that culture of psychological safety that we were just talking about.
Where people feel safe speaking up, sharing their experiences, and learning from each other.
Precisely.
And finally, there's the challenge of distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable mistakes, which, let's be honest, it isn't always, black and white.
Right. Not all mistakes are created equal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we differentiate? How do we differentiate between those, learning moments and mistakes that are just not okay?
It's about establishing clear guidelines and expectations. What constitutes an acceptable mistake versus one that requires a different course of action. And these are conversations that you need to have with your team to create that shared understanding.
So it's about setting those boundaries, making sure everyone is on the same page.
Exactly. It's about creating that balance between encouraging risk-taking and, maintaining accountability.
It's about finding that sweet spot where people feel empowered to innovate without the fear of, being penalized for honest mistakes.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears for a bit and talk about the return on investment.
Because let's be real, as frontline managers, we want to know these strategies actually make a difference, right?
Absolutely. And the guide has some pretty compelling research that shows just how powerful embracing mistakes can be for your team and for your bottom line.
Okay, hit us with the good stuff. What kind of impact are we talking here?
Well, for starters, a Harvard Business School study found that companies with a culture that embraces mistakes see a 37% higher employee engagement rate compared to those that don't.
Well, wow, 37%. That's huge. I mean, engaged employees are happy employees.
And happy employees are productive employees, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And it
Yeah.
doesn't stop there. A report by Accenture found that companies with that fail-fast mentality are twice as likely to successfully navigate digital transformations.
Which in today's world is critical. Everything's changing so fast, you got to be able to adapt and innovate to stay ahead of the game.
Exactly. And if you're still not convinced, a study from the University of Michigan found that teams who openly discuss their mistakes solve problems 25% faster than those who don't.
So not only are we creating this more positive and engaging work environment, but we're also seeing, these tangible improvements in productivity, problem solving, innovation. That's a win-win in my book.
It's about recognizing that embracing mistakes isn't just some, touchy-feely management trend. It's a strategic approach that can deliver real results.
Okay, I'm sold. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on those real-world examples that the guide highlights, because sometimes there's nothing more inspiring than seeing these principles in action.
Absolutely. And the guide has some great ones. Let's start with WD-40. I mean, everyone knows WD-40, right?
Right, it's like a staple in every household.
But what most people don't know is that the name WD-40 actually stands for Water Displacement 40th Attempt.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So they had 39 failed attempts before they landed on the formula we know and love today.
Exactly. But instead of throwing in the towel, they embraced those failures as learning opportunities. They kept iterating, kept experimenting, and ultimately created a product that's used in countless applications worldwide.
Talk about perseverance. Okay, what about Slack? It feels like they just exploded onto the scene and became an overnight success.
It seems that way, right? But Slack actually started as this internal communication tool for a video game company. And guess what? The game flopped.
Ouch. So what happened? Did they just scrap the whole thing?
Not at all. They recognized that even though the game hadn't been successful, their communication tool had real potential.
They saw the diamond in the rough. That's incredible.
It is, and it just goes to show that sometimes, our biggest successes can come from the things we initially perceive as failures.
And of course, no conversation about embracing mistakes would be complete without mentioning Google's famous 20% time.
Absolutely. This policy, which encourages employees to dedicate 20% of their time to personal projects, has led to some of Google's most groundbreaking innovations. Gmail, Google Maps, even AdSense.
It's amazing to think that these game-changing ideas came from what was essentially sanctioned tinkering. It just goes to show that you never know where that next big idea is going to come from. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just give your team the freedom to experiment and explore.
Exactly. And a lot of these 20% time projects probably started as experiments, like diversions from the main roadmap, things that could have easily been dismissed as distractions.
Right.
But by creating that space for exploration, for trial and error, Google fostered an environment where innovation could thrive.
Exactly. So for those listening who are ready to, implement these ideas, where's a good place to start?
The guide lays out this really practical 30-day action plan.
Mhm.
Can help you dip your toes into these strategies.
Walk us through it. What's step one?
It starts with you. Take a week and create your own failure resume. Then share it with your team. It's a powerful way to set the tone, and show them that you're serious about creating a culture where mistakes are viewed as learning opportunities.
We'll lead by example, right?
Exactly. In week 2, hold your first mistake of the month meeting, pick a recent project or situation where things didn't quite go as planned, and just have an open and honest discussion about what happened and what you can learn from it.
Remember, no finger pointing.
Absolutely. It's about collective analysis, not placing blame. In week 3, it's time to put your money where your mouth is and develop a system for rewarding intelligent risk-taking.
I love that. It's about celebrating, the effort, the creativity, the willingness to push boundaries, even if things don't always pan out perfectly.
Exactly. And finally, in week 4, put that pre-mortem technique into practice. Before kicking off your next big project, gather your team and do a pre-mortem session. Imagine the project failed miserably and work backward to pinpoint potential pitfalls and areas for improvement.
This 30-day plan gives our listeners a really, a clear roadmap for integrating these principles into their leadership styles.
And remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Start small, experiment, see what works best for you and your team.
That's such an important point. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's about adapting these principles to, your unique team dynamics, your organizational context.
Exactly. As you embark on this journey, just ask yourself, how can you as a leader not only embrace your own mistakes, but also cultivate an environment where your team feels safe and empowered to do the same?
It's such a powerful question to consider. It's about creating a culture where vulnerability is seen as a strength, where learning from mistakes is celebrated, and where innovation can flourish. And that wraps up our deep dive on embracing mistakes. We hope you've walked away with some actionable insights and a fresh perspective on how to turn those inevitable slip-ups into stepping stones toward success. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about embracing the learning process and using those experiences to fuel your growth. Until next time, keep learning, keep experimenting, and keep embracing those mistakes.